thank you everyone again for being here in person or via Zoom today. It looks like we have 30 people on the Zoom right now, so truly I know we're working with a lot of different time zones and everything. I really appreciate all your guys' time. Thank you for listening to my research of the past 2 years. So today I'll be talking about the Lake Superior Water Trail, as Melissa prefaced, and my research investigates how different entities and communities have engaged directly or indirectly with the trail, as well as what governance models exist today with the Lake Superior Water Trail. And with that being said, thank you again for all being here, and I'll get started. So just a quick overview of what I'll be talking about today. I'll get into my background first, then some of my objectives and questions, go into my methodology, and then I have 3 sections that kind of cover some of my results. And those are of governance interactions, some water trail progress histories and timelines of Minnesota, Michigan, and Wisconsin, classifying what my 2 governance models are, and then getting into some more of my recommendations. So starting off with my background. So the Great Lakes are massive, and with about 10,900 miles of shoreline throughout all of the Great Lakes, that equates to about 44% of the Earth's circumference. So it's kind of clear that the Great Lakes aren't just some massive water body. They're these living ecosystems that impact so many parts of our lives and have a lot of socio-ecological complex impacts, whether that's ecological, infrastructural, cultural, economical, or social. There's really a limitless thing to what the Great Lakes are a part of. So with this nearly 11,000 miles of shoreline, they offer immense potential for recreation, such as paddling. And in this case, and in recent years, the idea of a multinational, multimodal Great Lakes coastal trail network has started to take shape, both in writing and on the ground. And on the screen here are just some examples of trail ideas that are being implemented or are being ideated. And in terms of the pieces of the puzzle for trails around the Great Lakes system, each of the 5 Great Lakes host their own evolving trail systems currently. And today we're going to be talking specifically about water trails. And for reference, a water trail is a mapped and managed recreational route that features infrastructure such as something as simple as bathrooms to signage and other things that might be involved in a rest area or an access site. So when we zoom specifically into Lake Superior, we're going to be looking at this lovely graphic created by the Lake Superior Watershed Conservancy, and I think Joni and Gary McGuffin of that conservancy are on today the Zoom, so thank you guys for being here, and thanks for helping create this great graphic. But as we look at here, we find this massive water body with very cool water trail potential. And in Canada, the Lake Superior Water Trail has been very well thought out. In 1989, Canadian paddlers Gary and Joni McGuffin first proposed a water-based trail in the area that was inspired by Indigenous and fur trade routes. It then gained significant momentum in 2013 when the Trans-Canada Trail in Ontario set out to establish a fully connected and official route along the North Shore of Superior in time for their 150th anniversary in 2017. So by 2017, 600 miles of water trail in Ontario from the Pigeon River here to the St. Mary's River were completed, and this is all managed under a very collaborative nonprofit, which is the Lake Superior Watershed Conservancy. And this nonprofit is still headed by Gary and Joni today. But when we look at the United States, a quick Google search of the Lake Superior Water Trail doesn't produce the same clarity for who might manage it in the US. And while the Canadian portion of the trail is linked and official with the Trans-Canada Trail, national designation for the states doesn't exactly exist yet for Lake Superior. And a national designation requires a demonstrated and quite large commitment to best management practices that are set forth by the National Park Service. And you'll see the 7 categories of the best management practices here. These prioritize like continuous, safe public access, infrastructure at some capacity, and a community-driven stewardship plan. So all of these are very important in the success and continuation of a long-term trail. And this brings us to our case study today. A fully connected and state or nationally designated Lake Superior Water Trail on both the United States and Canadian sides and this would be a very powerful model for Great Lakes collaboration. As we can see here, the United States portion of the US spans about 900 miles, with its 3 states and 12 federally recognized Indigenous coastal nations along the shores. And it offers this unique opportunity to look at the governance. Since we cross a lot of political boundaries here in multiple jurisdictions, we need a lot of cohesive governance in order to make this a successful trail. So we're going to take a second now to define, I've used the word governance quite a few times now, so we're going to find out what it means. It's kind of a heftier academic term, but at its core, it's simply how economic, political, and administrative authority is used to manage a resource. In this case, it would be the water trail. And it encompasses all the different nuts and bolts that dictate how citizens and groups get to express their interests, exercise their rights, and ultimately resolve any differences that they might have in the context. But some things can happen when governance breaks down or becomes really fragmented. We can look at some land trails like the Pacific Crest Trail or the John Muir Trail. And studies from Goldenberg, for example, have shown that when key land managers were involved on these trails, like the Forest Service, the Park Service, Bureau of Land Management, if they fail to coordinate with each other, it creates a lot of real problems on the ground. Visitors have been known to face uneven rule enforcement, and it's not just the visitors facing uneven enforcement, it's also the land itself. There's a completely inconsistent experience across the trail, and because a lot of these agencies might have overlapping jurisdictions and very different goals from one another for the land, administration becomes incredibly complicated. So the fix for this is adaptive governance, and that's getting all these agencies to use shared data systems, communicate regularly, and form joint planning work groups to actually manage those competing objectives. And from a lot of other studies within my literature review, it was clear that the old top-down ways of managing conservation doesn't work as well anymore as we might have thought. Ecological systems and public interests are very complex, and there needs to be a lot of collaboration. So effective governance has to be networked among many different entities. And by taking the Lake Superior Water Trail as our case study and applying Eagle's 8 governance models, he designed these and kept formulating them since 2009. We can apply them to the Lake Superior Water Trail and see what might be best to manage sustainability for the trail. And the last part of my literature review that will be important to talk about here is community engagement. And within this research, when we talk about community engagement, it's really talking about collaboration. It's the process of working directly with groups of people, whether they're connected by geography, a shared interest, or a similar situation, to address the issues that might be affecting them. And for my own study, that meant looking at a whole spectrum of different interactions that were included, just from basic communication to active public participation, all aimed at building those two-way partnerships. All right, and into my objectives that will lead into my questions. I had these main 5 objectives that really facilitated into these 3 questions. And with these, I was trying to look at the reality on the ground of the trail. So identifying the key players, the key stakeholders, and what their stakeholder roles might be. Analyzing how these stakeholders, who are the entities, are actually engaging with the community. And then defining the overarching governance models that do exist today with the Lake Superior Water Trail. With that being said, we're going to get into the start of my methods. And to start out my study, you guys kind of just got a brief and summarized view of my literature review. It set the stage by exploring some of the historical, cultural, and administrative layers of Superior's region, whether that be from the enduring Indigenous stewardship or the modern complexities of multi-jurisdictional governance and community engagement. The next step, which happened to be probably my most time-intensive step of my study, was moving on to standardizing conceptual frameworks. And these allowed me to establish some stricter baselines for how I would categorize and measure my objectives and questions. So measuring the stakeholder roles and measuring community engagement strategies. So the first conceptual framework of 3, these are my 3 right here, was stakeholder roles. And these were adapted from McGrath and Whitty. And I thought of this as a hierarchy of influence. So at the very top, we have our invested entities, who are the groups that either control the land and access, or they're the ones who have directly shaped the planning of the trail. So there's two options that allow for an entity to be invested. There's also the contributing entities that are right below them. And while they don't hold the ultimate authority like an invested might, they do provide essential funding, coordination, and advocacy that really impact the trail in beneficial ways. And then we have observers whose general awareness and their kind of sign-offs on the trail keep it running smoothly. And lastly, at the very bottom, we have some end users, and those are the people who actually depend on and just kind of might benefit from the trail existing, but they don't do much to actually affect the management. The second conceptual framework here is the IAP2 spectrum of public participation levels. And that's this little graphic right here that we'll get into. And I want to include the actual graphic to show what the spectrum looks like if you looked it up online. But there's a lot to it and a lot of words. So we're going to move to a little bit more of a simplified graphic. So you can think of this spectrum as more of an escalator of engagement with the public. So at the base level here, we have inform, which is simply providing objective facts like maps or websites. Then we move to consult, where entities are actively asking for feedback through surveys or comment periods. The middle stage is involve, and that's where you're bringing the public into the conversation a bit more, whether that be through advisory meeting or advisory committees to work through the concerns together. We then move to collaborate, which is a bit higher, and that's where the public starts to become a bit more of a true partner in co-designing solutions. And the last part of this spectrum is empowered, and that's where the final decision-making and authority is completely handed over to the public, and the public is the one that gets to make the decisions that matter. So the third and final conceptual framework that I was standardizing was the democracy Q profiles, and these were adapted from Fung. These are broken down into 3 different dimensions that I'm gonna get into. It's who participates, how do participants communicate and make decisions, and then how do they hold their authority and power. You can see through this little graphic, that's how Fung kind of had it organized. Start with the participants. We have the expert administrators here at the top and professional representatives who are kind of the ones participating because it's their job. That could include examples like the Department of Natural Resources, the DNR, Coast Guard, regional planning commissions for professional representatives. Then we move into professional stakeholders like the friends, like different friend groups. There's a lot of different parks and trails that have associated non-governmental organizations that are friend groups. These manage the segments as part of their nonprofit duties. And from there, the circle widens to include lay stakeholders, which could be just local residents and business owners. Then community panels, that can be randomly selected. That could also include juries of randomly selected people. There might also be groups of a certain demographic that are targeted, like Indigenous communities or paddling clubs for certain management decisions where their input is particularly wanted. And then at the most inclusive end on the bottom, we have the open self-selected volunteers. And that could include people, for example, for Milwaukee River Keepers river cleanup, where you're just going out yourself to go clean up the river. It's your choice to go out there. We then have at the end diffuse public sphere, which just represents the general public receiving information in some capacity. Again, that could just be through a website. The second dimension of 3 is the communication decision mode, and that is kind of just saying how is input really being exchanged with one another. So on one end, we have technical expertise, and that's like sharing ecological modeling or invasive species data. You are kind of doing that research yourself. And then we move into deliberation and negotiation, and that's where partners who might have been doing that are actually sitting down to plan habitat or watershed management together. They're coming together as a group to talk about everything. We also see aggregating and bargaining, which is often where non-governmental organizations might negotiate for funding or for access priorities. For the broader public, this dimension kind of looks more like developing or expressing their preferences through surveys, public meetings, or online comments. Their information that they submit could then be disseminated to a maybe a more lead agency. And then at the most passive level, we have individuals listening as a spectator, and that could, again, just be reading a map or a newsletter. As you'll see, there's kind of a lot of similarities between these different frameworks in terms of what they apply to. And the last dimension is authority and power, or more simply, who actually holds the influence. And this model, or this graphic here, is a little bit switched because we're going to start at the bottom and go to the top. But at the highest level, at the bottom, you have direct authority where agencies, for example, a Department of Natural Resources, make final operational calls. Then we have co-governance, which is more of a true partnership again, where stewardship responsibilities are shared. That might be with Indigenous governments or other key partner organizations. We then move to advise and consult, which is just below and above in this case, where technical groups provide input, but even though they're providing that input, they're not having any say on the final vote. Communicative influence is where groups can shape the conversation and frame priorities from their own desires, but again, they're not having any say on the final decision. And then the very last thing is individual education, and that's more so if you're a person going out on a trail, you're indirectly changing your own behavior by abiding to the National Park Service's Leave No Trace principles. So those are my 3 conceptual frameworks I was using a lot throughout the rest of this study. But to move from theory into the real world, I created a stakeholder database next in my methods that I used a lot for interview recruitment. It also served as a good policy analysis tool to help me visualize, okay, who are these possible entities that might be at play that I should talk to throughout the trail, and identifying where I need to go next with that. It was a really big organizational component for me. And then with this clearer picture of who might be involved from this database, directly or indirectly, I began the interview process. And I broke that down into a couple key phases. So I used my stakeholder database for targeted recruitment to ensure I was reaching more or less the right voices. Again, some of them might have had more indirect impacts. Then I developed a semi-structured questionnaire designed to keep the conversation focused while allowing for those hopefully more deeper personal insights or just fun recreational stories of people up there involved on the trail. In total, I spoke with about 47 entities across Wisconsin, Michigan, and Minnesota. And it should be noted that the variation in sample sizes was kind of a result of achieving theoretical saturation within each context rather than a reflection of there's only so many, or like 17 Wisconsin, 16 Michigan. And within this study, theoretical saturation was achieved when subsequent interviews just became more redundant, serving only to confirm existing themes rather than generating any new conceptual categories within like the IAP2 spectrum or the democracy cube. So while the interviews provided very good personal insights, I also added more of a formal policy and trail document analysis as a second layer to validate anything that might have had bias throughout my interviews. So from here, we can get into the trail progress histories for each state. So we can look at Minnesota and see how it functions on an operational level. The foundation of the trail's success comes down to a very clear systemic division of labor between 2 key players, which are the state and a dedicated nonprofit. And there's a pretty interdependent partnership that was formed. On one side, we have the invested stakeholder, which was the Minnesota DNR, and they were legally designated to coordinate the trail back in 1993 with a role to handle the heavy lifting and some of the more heavy capital management. They're also the ones securing massive public funds to acquire land, like easements, place signage, and execute large-scale ecological restorations, like the massive cleanups and habitat rebuilding in the St. Louis River estuary. So they're kind of the structural and financial foundation of the trail in this state. And then on the other side, we have a contributing stakeholder, which is the Lake Superior Water Trail Association. And this group actually started as lobbyists who pitched the trail idea to the state back in 1992, before the trail even existed on paper. So today, because the state handles the heavy capital investments, the association is a bit more freed up to do what it does best, like continuous grassroots maintenance. They tend to mobilize a lot of passionate volunteers and recreational paddlers to handle day-to-day upkeep that might not be as much of a priority when the DNR has so many other things to be doing.
So, moving to the power dynamics on the trail, if we apply the democracy framework, we see a decent balance between direct authority and communicative influence. Again, the DNR holds this direct authority by controlling this complex legal infrastructure, like securing 100-year leases for $1 from mining companies that helped them with easements. And they also have access to quite a bit of money from their water recreation account. However, in terms of their capacity, they don't have a dedicated line item budget just for the trail. This trail is competing with a ton of other recreational priorities. So that's where the nonprofit steps in with their large amount of communicative influence. And throughout the interviews, it was clear, or state officials readily admitted that without the nonprofit acting as a dedicated advocate, state attention would likely easily get diverted to kind of the squeaky wheel elsewhere in the park system. So, looking at how stakeholders actually engage within the community, trail organizers historically had to heavily involve and collaborate with skeptics and landowners just to get the trail approved. But today, public engagement has transitioned into a more of a delegated system, as we've seen throughout the past couple slides. So the state is surprisingly hands-off with the general public. They operate mostly in a consult stance with the nonprofit's leadership. And then in turn, the nonprofit takes ownership of involving the public through grassroots stewardship, like their Adopt a Beach program, and volunteer maintenance programs. We also see a pretty conscious approach to Indigenous engagement in Minnesota. Local organizations use target recruitment to bring tribal voices to advisory councils, but they were often balancing the desire to collaborate with more of a practical respect for tribal sovereignty, opting for more inform and consult stances. So, in terms of communicating with the everyday paddler from the Minnesota DNR, there was a heavy inform stance. So, while the nonprofit is more interacting with them directly, their Minnesota DNR's website is heavily populated with information for the everyday paddler to use and then engage with their leave no trace principles. Here are just some of the other said maps and guides produced during the time. And with this, Minnesota falls under the public nonprofit combination model, which kind of plays to everyone's strength. It's very common in conservation and balances official rules with some more grassroots energy and tended to align more with the literature review in what would be efficient governance. For sake of time, I'll try and skim through Wisconsin and Michigan pretty quickly. Um, but focusing on Wisconsin, the model here in the measures of governance here proved pretty vulnerable. Initially, they had a nonprofit called the Inland Sea Society who was pretty involved, but then that dissolved after a few different projects were completed with the trail, some different pilot segments, and nobody was left to pick up the slack. So today, the trail is very decentralized. And here are some of the access guides made by the prominent entities during the heat of their action time. They partnered with the National Park Service. But after about 2014, nothing else happened, and environmental professionals and state agencies have since defaulted to more of an observer role, while local municipalities act as a fractured group of invested stakeholders managing specific isolated locations, but not directly focusing on the trail, just dealing with other issues that might affect paddlers in general. I'm just going to skip over to Michigan real quick. So here we see a story characterized by fluctuating grassroots activity, followed by, again, some more institutional dormancy. Similarly, there's no central direct authority today. In the 1990s, there were some passionate volunteer nonprofits who stepped up as invested stakeholders. But in the mid-2010s, there was a recreational kayak crisis, and there was some conflict between nonprofits and tourism boards. And so any motion that was going forward with the trail kind of lost that motion and fell apart. And today, the trail in Michigan is primarily just listed on the Water Trails site that's headed by the state, and it's pretty much only digital consolidation. And for sake of time, we're just gonna go to this slide. So in Wisconsin and Michigan, the traditional community model has become apparent where larger organized efforts have dropped off, leaving local municipalities and informal groups to lead somewhat indirect stewardship. It's built more on local place-based stewardship and collective decision making, and it doesn't really have any formal statewide policies that fall through it. So, moving into a bit of a discussion, Minnesota succeeds because it uses a polycentric governance distributing power across different tiers. Conversely, Wisconsin and Michigan show us what happens when a system fractures without that central invested entity. The collaborative framework collapses. And while statutory designation is important, if the trail can follow all best management practices, it still needs that collaborative. They can get that designation, but even after they get that designation, they still need to have that collaborative to continue the trail. But overall, a state designation for Michigan and Wisconsin would be great because it would serve as a decent catalyst to build a sense of place and collective ownership among the communities up there. And when we evaluate these community engagement strategies, nonprofits seem to be the best engines for building collective ownership. Groups like the Lake Superior Water Trail Association and the St. Louis River Alliance in Minnesota succeed because they treat the community as part of the trail ecosystem. They don't just drop a map on the website, they do deep relational co-design, like spending a year speaking with marginalized neighborhoods to identify barriers before ever writing a formal development plan. That was something really interesting that the St. Louis River Alliance did. And interestingly, across the US side, no public participation ever reached the empower level. So even in Minnesota, where there was power divided between the nonprofit, in the end, everything rested with the DNR. So, looking at the Canadian segment of the trail, we see that Ontario operates under a nonprofit model. It's very empowered, though. They get support from the Trans-Canada Trail and the government, but then they also are able to deeply integrate their own actions by operating with the communities, and they also integrate First Nations communities directly into their planning, which is very important. This would be an ideal framework for a governance model based off of the results of my study.
So finally, we're gonna get into some of my recommendations. I appreciate you guys bearing with me so far. To transition the Lake Superior Water Trail before doing anything else, from a more fragmented collection of assets and land into a resilient Great Lakes Coastal Trail Network puzzle piece. Recommendations are really important to really further that along. And the first one's going to be reframing engagement with communities. So before implementing any structural changes, we have to undergo a shift on how we view community engagement in the context of trail development even. We can have all these access sites, as you see here from all the states, mapped and inventoried, but those are just points on a map. They're not anything if the community themselves isn't engaged in wanting to really bring the trail in and be a part of it. So too often, a lot of our outreach has related to framing these communities as implementers of the trail skills, but we need to be looking at where is there opportunity for each community. This more effective and equitable approach would emphasize what the trail can offer in return and reframing around this mutual benefit rather than volunteerism or just maintenance alone can really be seen with the Lake Superior Watershed Conservancy and the work they did with Canada. This Canadian portion offers an excellent example of intentional community reframing engagement. And so the developers, Joni and Gary, I think they had to leave about 30 minutes in, but if they are here, again, thank you for your inspiration on this. They kayaked the proposed route in the 1990s when they were ideating the trail. And they stopped at each coastal community, going in person, asking what would interest you about having a trail here. So their tangible results included 15 priority access locations with the communities who really wanted to be a part of it, with ADA accessible best management practices, as well as educational components. They really wanted to make sure no matter what your trip length was, no matter what, how you were able to get around, you could take part in the trail. So they also really wanted to celebrate the cultural aspects of each of their sites. So not only would they have a safety flyer at each of these points, they would also have different things that represented the communities that you would be docking at, whether that was cultural elements, bed and breakfasts, just things that visitors would be taking advantage of in terms of tourism. But they really did a great job at incorporating this recommendation that I would have for the current trail. And those recommendations really build into the national designation best management practices that I talked about way at the beginning. Those are the 7 categories. And in order for states like Michigan and Wisconsin to become state designated, but even for Minnesota to possibly receive like a federal and national designation, we need to follow and integrate these best management practices. And one that I really want to take a look at and delve a little bit more into is the recreation best management practice. And the recreation best management practice says that the water trail route must have established public access points, and these should accommodate, again, that diversity of trip lengths and trip users. So it's important to look here. It's not just Wisconsin, Michigan also has some really big gaps, but we're gonna pull up Wisconsin as an example here. A lot of the recommended guidelines throughout any water trail is that you should only have between 10 miles as the longest possible gap before you can get off and just have safety shelter if you need. But a lot of the Wisconsin trail segments really surpass that 10 miles, going up to 36.6 miles, in fact. And as a result, paddlers face this massive commitment with virtually no safe and official exit. So without initial funding, definitely a lot harder to secure easements, but going to these communities in the first place and getting maybe a little bit more unofficial access to create closer segments would be a really great way in order to achieve this best management practice. So one important thing to know is who is gonna do any of this? Who's going to go to all these communities and make sure that any of these practices are met within the states? And this leads into the following recommendation of establishing the central management entity. This would be a collaborative organization, maybe an umbrella of all of these. So this organization would host multiple entities, keeping track of the water trail, actions that need to be done, etc. And to show the importance, Melissa actually sent me this article last week, and I found the link on Twitter, so I thought it'd be important to show. The importance of having a managing entity that oversees the trail can just be seen with this. Just last week, the Great Lakes Way had this article released. They're without like a main steward, a main managing entity, as their Southeast Michigan, I'm blanking on the rest of their title, is no longer going to be their main coordinating entity. So they've had all this development happen with their trail, but even though the development happened, if there's no one there to continue it, that trail is not going to be able to have its maximum impact. So again, that permanence of a central managing entity is essential. So this recommendation could really follow and be modeled after the Grand River Watershed Partnership, which is made up of the Lower Grand River, Upper Grand River, and Middle Grand River. And at 262 miles, this is the longest river in Michigan, has the second largest watershed and a massive population. Yeah, all of these three nonprofits under that one partnership are able to manage, cooperate together, share their data, and really have a successful water trail. This could eventually be mirrored for the Lake Superior Water Trail in terms of creating Lake Superior Water Trail Collaborative. And that core function would be harmonization. Those first steps could be just standardizing safety classifications. So again, making sure that those access sites are close enough to each other, and even creating a unified branding identity throughout the United States. And then this also leads into professionalizing decentralized stewardship. Ultimately, a collaborative can bridge a gap between state authority and local action, really bringing a bunch of entities together. But we have to really encourage those community members and also have some initial funding. So the first one to talk about was inspired by Penn State's extension program, and it would be a trail circuit rider. So this would be a person who is a full-time professional hired by the collaborative, and that's funded from all these entities who are part of it. And that full-time professional would be able to provide what would be individual resource core groups with critical technical assistance, whether that's grant writing, GIS mapping, liability coordination, really just a great initial person to have as the collaborative before you keep growing it. And then this shared cost approach would especially be useful for Wisconsin and Michigan, where they're not really getting any direct funding for their trail, and they're not going to get any direct funding for their trail until they are able to actually become designated. So it kind of becomes a trap for them. So this is a good way to kind of get out of that trap. And the second aspect of this, and last thing I'll talk about, is the Water Trail Steward Certification Program. And this would help with that community engagement, getting them involved. This formalizes and trains volunteers in essential skills related to water trails, like water safety, invasive species management, and it gives them an official certification by the state, and turns them more into contributing stakeholders rather than just end users of the trail. So it really gives them more of a sense of empowerment on what they're doing and might create a higher place-based value for wanting to get engaged with the trail. So I said that was my last thing because I forgot I had one more recommendation, but I'll go through this one quite quickly. The last thing is this interactive governance atlas. The Milwaukee Urban Water Trail by Milwaukee Riverkeeper does an excellent job at incorporating all of these different details, but the coolest thing I think is that if you click on any of the access points like that one, and that's Harrington State Beach Park in Wisconsin, that it'll open up even more information for the viewer, but particularly I feel like it shows some more management transparency by showing who the owner is of that access point so that users can go and contact them if anything about the access point seems weird. You can also then go to the collaborative who can have all those contacts information. So just a really excellent example. And if you add in a citizen science integration, again, just empowering that community to take an extra step, you can have them record any of their observations, whether that's something wrong with the trail, erosion, anything, even weather tips, share it on the Atlas site. People can discuss their findings together, really increasing that communication about the trail. And I think that'd be an excellent addition to this type of geographic map. And thank you all so much. I think the very last thing is that the long-term success of this trail relies on our ability to share power and collaborate, and the responsibility for this trail is just as fluid as the water itself. With that being said, truly thank you all so much for bearing with me today and taking your time. Thank you to everyone on Zoom. I really appreciate you all being here. And I would love to acknowledge Melissa Scanlon, Deja Piroff, and then Amber Wachowski for being on my committee for my thesis. Thank you so much for reading the absorbently long document that I provided to you guys. I don't know if they're still on the call, but a big thank you to the Watershed Conservancy, Northwest Regional Planning Commission, and Wisconsin Coastal Management Agency. You all talked to me multiple times and gave me a lot of initial information to kind of start going with my research. A big thank you to everyone I interviewed, and the Berkeley Foundation Scholarship for a continued project I'll be working on related to this research. Thank you all, and no worries if there aren't any questions or comments, but thank you so much.
Thanks, Cami. I think we have time for probably one or two questions.
Perfect.
So,
Can I ask a two-part question? Can I see
Yes.
two quick ones? Real quick, just on your results, when you had your, you showed some unevenness in your interviewees. Did you go back though to see if maybe they were balanced in terms of shoreline or stakeholder density, even though they were kind of chosen ad hoc?
Yeah. So when I went back and kind of created those timelines, that really kind of allowed me to see, okay, these are like the direct players in action. But I think a lot of the imbalance came because, so in Minnesota, in Wisconsin, there's 4 counties that are, it's Iron County, Bayfield, Ashland, and I'm blanking on the 4th. But so that variation in the different amount of counties in terms of like parks and recs people to contact, I definitely was off on those between. So they weren't necessarily essential because they weren't like the predominant drivers. But that variation, I thought, okay, maybe one of them has done something with an access point or really takes advantage of their access point for where paddlers can come in. And I didn't get to talk to them or something like that. If that answers your question.
So do you think Wisconsin was underrepresented?
I think the most underrepresented state would have been Minnesota, just because they had 10, and I would have talked to more of their just local municipalities.
Okay.
Even though it became kind of clear that like for them it was the DNR and this nonprofit, I think talking to more of their municipalities, they have a lot of national forest sites right along the water, and I didn't really get to talk extensively with those guys either. So it would have been nice to see like what small actions they were doing there.
And then the second real quick question is, as a science, fellow in a science communication fellow, besides a formal class in science communication, where did you get your, what did you learn or where did you get your best information, either through reading something or your vast knowledge on science communication? Or mentorship or example?
I think like the thing that clicks and comes to mind the most is honestly Robin Wall Kimmerer's for all of her the books that she's authored, like Rating Speakgrass, her book about moss. I just think being able to turn it into a story is super interesting and keeps me engaged, and I tend to get distracted easily. So I think if a book can do a good job at that, it's great. But I feel like her being able to incorporate those storytelling skills into anything, drawing from her inspiration has been really a good learning tool to use.
Are there any questions on Zoom that you?
And Aaron, I can answer your question too.
Yeah, go ahead. It's a, here's one.
So we can bounce to that then in case there's.
Kelly said, is there any resistance to having a centralized management structure among stakeholders? Among the 47 that I spoke to, no, it's just the problem that no one at the current moment has the capacity. I think the managing entity really needs to kind of come in on their own and say, hey, I'm gonna get all these people together. So someone who has a lot of passion for the project, or one group, like I'm not any managing agency that might have a bit of money needs to create like a little bit of a smaller subsection of that. But there was no resistance to answer your question. Everyone wants it, it's just there's not a lot of capacity or funding to support it right now.
So in some instances when maybe like kind of the top level governance or guidance kind of maybe wasn't there, or the resources, and then in some cases I've seen, especially in the 2010s, that especially in Wisconsin and Michigan, some of the NGOs that were leading the way were kind of dissolving. Were there any instances where municipalities, because they seem to be, especially on the economic level, those with the most at stake along these potential trails, was there any attempt for municipalities, especially along maybe just like specific stretches of potential trail, to band together and have some sort of cooperative effort to get something going on trail development?
Like contemporary, like throughout, like
Let's go contemporary. Yeah, sure.
contemporarily in Michigan, no. A lot of the regional planning commissions, especially there were 3 main regional planning commissions in Michigan. The Eastern Upper Peninsula Regional Planning Commission, they have massive acronyms. They, I think, were the most active yet still stagnant in it right now. They wanted to go engage with communities, but again, just that lack of funding. But when I talked with them, their interviewee was really like a big proponent of the trail and wanting to reconnect. It just couldn't happen. But there was no nonprofits that I was talking to or smaller groups that were doing that in Michigan. In Wisconsin, I would say, although like not like small grassroots necessarily, but Northwest Regional Planning Commission, and then also Wisconsin Coastal Management Agency in parts. But Jason Lawman of Northwest Regional Planning Commission definitely still has, I feel like, a bit of a burning passion for the trail, which was great to talk to him about. And similar to the other Michigan Planning Commission, it's just like that desire is there, but just the capacity is not necessarily like able to make it happen. But that's why, like Northwest Regional Planning Commission, I feel like kind of because of Jason Lawman, keeps it on the website and keeps it active because you want people to be aware of it. And then in Minnesota, the Lake Superior Water Trail Association just tries to get as many people involved. I know they post on their socials and Facebook all the time about events, but that's about it. There's no like really up and coming group that's working on things. If I do want to answer one last question from Mike, there's from Wisconsin Coastal Management. Okay. To answer your question, he asked, have you looked at other groups like the Lower Wisconsin Riverway Board or the St. Louis River Alliance? I haven't looked at the Lower Wisconsin Riverway Board. I did talk with the St. Louis River Alliance throughout my research, and they're also a phenomenal example of a group that's really restored part of the watershed. The St. Louis River Alliance is based out, I think, between like, it's in like the Duluth area of Minnesota. And their executive director, Chris Eilers, is just really excellent. And she talked a lot about how having that nonprofit group, they got their funding, I'm forgetting exactly what they got their funding from, but I think it was like public or government grants. But because they were a nonprofit and able to engage a lot of local communities, draw on volunteers, like not everyone had to be paid, they were able to like just excel so well. So I do highly recommend San Luis River Alliance as a group to look at when developing a trail, because they're doing it tough. Anyways, thank you all for the questions and everything. I keep looking at the computer for some clarity, like you guys are seeing me from there, but thank you all for your questions. Thank you all for your questions. Is anything else you want me to say?
No, it's great that Mike got the last question from the Wisconsin, coastal management, because they were heavily involved in the trail. Shout out to our Canadian friends. Thanks for showing the way on how to do this correctly. And also to our Minnesota friends. We don't like your football team, but we do like your trail. Thank you, all of you, for being here, and everyone here in the room and on Zoom. What happens next is Cami goes and meets with her committee and has her more formal thesis defense. And so join me now in giving her some appreciation before we go into that next phase of this. All right.
Thank you. Zoom is a little bit weird right now, so I'm just trying to step into the camera and just say, thank you guys, have a great day.